Asmodeus! Let's talk about Genesys format. So this past weekend was the 300th YCS, and the proving ground for Genesys format at large-scale tournaments. Previously, Genesys has been available at YCSs as an invitational. You would play a pod, and the first, or sometimes first and second, players in that pod would move on to a secondary tournament that happened a little bit later. At the 300th YCS, they did something a little bit different. They hosted a main event at the same time as the advanced main event, in which individuals could play Genesys format in lieu of advanced. These proto-YCSs were conducted like YCSs and attracted pretty reasonable crowds. But they were also the first opportunity for people who had played Genesys to play like a reasonable number of rounds. Previously, to get to an invitational, you had to go like 3-1 or 4-0, followed by just winning a top 64 bracket. Now, you had to sit down and play like 11, 12 rounds of Genesys, so people started labbing. What's more, the format is now old enough that metagames are starting to develop, and I'm excited to say that, alongside myself, other content creators are putting in the work of helping people figure out what is good and what is bad. As a result, this is the first tournament that I think tested Genesys format's staying power, and not just its ability to be a weird dalliance during times that the TCG sucks balls. And how'd it go? Well, pretty good. For me. I ended the event 14th place. That's right, top 16, which would in a civilized country be considered a top. But unfortunately, all tops are now top 8, so bubbled out again. But still, like my best performance in a YCS ever. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't milk it a little bit. So as a result, we're going to walk through my deck and its choices. We're going to talk about the wider Genesys metagame and what you should be concerned about if you aim to play the format. We're going to talk about what the experience of playing it at a YCS was like, and we're going to talk about some point changes I would like to see in an upcoming format. That's right, we're just doing anything. This is just the Genesys video. Big Genesys video with a bunch of crap in it. Let's start with the deck. So here's the list, and it is Cool Tune. Not super surprising to people who've played the format. I think this deck is extremely good. It's very flexible. It's hard to pin down. There are a couple of decks in the format, Monarch and Galaxy Regenesis in particular, that I think automatically win if you don't draw hand traps, and this is a deck that gets to play a lot of hand traps as well as access some in-engine, and one of the decks that gets to make use of one of the incredibly powerful cards released in Bipro, Zalen the Shackled Dragon. I'll walk you through the choices that I made. First and foremost, 3 Rico, 3 Mix is not particularly surprising. 1 Red Nova is not super standard. People are usually on 2 or 3, but this card excels in multiples a lot more if you're playing the Herald of Orange Light package, which I wish I had. I was playing it until the 11th hour, but I cut it for 3 copies of DD Crow, and some different choices with respect to the number of fairies I was playing. I kept bricking on it in testing, but in reality, I think it would have served me a lot better than this card, which had pretty minimal utility against the top strategies. We've got a driver for some deltas later on. 3 Synchro Overtake, 3 Cool Tune Synchro, 3 JJ Cool Tune, 2 Duelist Genesis. Duelist Genesis could probably go up to 3, and JJ Cool Tune could probably go down to 2. When I boarded, I would usually board out of a JJ Cool Tune, a Synchro Overtake, and a Duelist Genesis if I needed 3 slots while going second. I did love playing this card at multiples. I know some individuals are only playing 1. I found the additional copies made hands way better because then it opens up a sort of flexibility for your trackmaker search, and more importantly allows you to play through things, functioning sort of as a way to trade for a 1-to-1 hand trap in hands where you expect your opponent is going to interrupt you. I liked it a great deal. 3 Effect Veiler, now that Trinities go at the end of the format. 3 Cyframe Gear Delta, the Q and Clip that are both pointed. 3 Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and 3 Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, which is not a particularly good card this format. I think it's kind of poorly positioned, but I did like that it was a tuner and a hand trap, which, I mean, what more can you say? In the extra, we've got the Ultimate Slayer package, and then 2 Loudness War, 3 RS, 3 Remix, 3 Trackmaker, and 1 Zalen the Shackled Dragon. Usually in the dark, my end board would be Remix plus Zalen, which you can make off of 1 card, or with better hands like an up track maker that could then be converted into something like a Loudness War. Any situation where I could have Zalen on board with like a Clip in hand or a Cool Tune Synchro set drastically improves the ability of this card to do anything. In the side, we have 2 GAMCLs. This was for a number of strategies. I was scared about Doomsy. This is a great way to tribute over Deoctorus. Scared about Super Quantum. This outs Magnum. There's a number of decks that just like end up making one too many guys, and this is a guy that then you don't have to worry about. Artifact Lancia was something I was off and on over and over again, and I'm so happy I was on. It is a card that does something against some of the top decks, and for that reason deserves a place over cards that frequently would do nothing against a lot of the top decks, like DD Crow in the main. I boarded this in the most frequently in testing against Monarch, because it's a mechanism that keeps them off of doing like Pantheism plays. You have to be kind of careful with it though, because if you activate it in response to like a Pantheism pitching something relevant, then they can maybe make use of the something relevant. I got myself in hot water a couple of times because my opponent would go Master Play and I'd immediately Lancia, then they'd be able to send the trap card, which gets them access to like the Zaborg summon on my turn. That said, that's preferable to them putting in a Pantheism if you don't think that you can get them on the crackback, which usually you can't because decks like that have a lot of survivability. 3 Ultimate Slayer, 3 Cosmic Cyclone, 1 Cool Toon Playlist, and 3 Gravity Collapse. This is in the main a lot of the time. I didn't love it in the main. Gravity Collapse here was in almost every Cool Toon list. The board plan in the dark would be I would just take out the Cyframe Gear, Delta, and the Driver when going first and board in these 4. Gravity Collapse was the worst card in my deck. I know a lot of individuals, specifically Kevin, were champing at the bit to get this card pointed to 100, and to be clear, I think that should happen. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but all of the top decks have a way to play around this. Think about Draco Tail. It doesn't commit to a summon until it is well past the point of no return. Archmage can just Turbo Graflair, who specials by way of an effect and then can pop the Gravity Collapse. Radiant Typhoon can just take 50/50s. A lot of situations where this card is not great. I think I resolved it once all weekend, and it won a game in which I was already winning, but I saw it frequently, and almost every time I thought, man, I wish this was just another piece of engine or maybe like a Cosmic Cyclone. Wouldn't recommend it moving forward. That's really all there is to say about my deck. I think the build itself wasn't fantastic. It's pretty normal, all things considered. I played in a Winamat after the event had concluded and basically got skill diffed by another Cool Toon player that I think had a much better build, including Orange Lights. That's what I would recommend moving forward on this strategy. Let's talk about my experience. So the Genesys event started a little later than Advanced, which was interesting to say the least. It meant that if you had a card that had people who were in Advanced and people who were in Genesys, one of them just kind of had to wait around for what was supposed to be a half hour but ended up being more like an hour. The Genesys event started at 10:30 on Saturday and went through 7 rounds of Swiss, followed by 4 rounds of Day 2 and a cut to top 8 on Sunday. This, first and foremost, I would say is probably wrong. I don't know why it panned out like this, but doesn't it make more sense to be 8 rounds Day 1 than 3 rounds Day 2? That's just much more analogous to how a normal YCS works. Like, why would you play more than half of another Saturday on Sunday? It was very strange. I will say the vibes were immaculate. I say this a lot of the time about a lot of events that I go to, but everyone was there having fun. Everyone was super excited to be playing Genesys, and importantly, everyone was playing meta. Looking around, I expected some people to be like, oh, I played Blackwing back in the day, so I brought Blackwing. And there just wasn't very much of that at all, especially post like round 2. It was individuals who by and large were playing the top decks in the format and playing them very capable. I saw maybe one deck that I wasn't super prepared for, and that's a good thing. It's fantastic to know that there is a meter stick by which you can engage with the format. It isn't just people throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. As a final note about the actual experience, I will say that I think the matches that they pulled up on camera were not fantastic. My understanding was that they were pulling them based on table numbers, but that ends up getting hairy. As you saw, the Super Quant woman was back to back. And they could have done a little more to screen for decks that had already been on camera. Like, I didn't get to watch the stream, but a lot of people online were whining about the frequency that Cool Toon and Radiant Typhoon were on stream, which I guess would be frustrating if you may have seen those already in the advanced portion. As you can see in the top cut, those decks were around, but weren't nearly as prevalent as coverage made it seem. Like, would it kill them to try and get the Doomsy player on earlier? I don't know if they did. On that note, let's talk about the top decks. First up is Monarch. This shouldn't surprise anyone. I expected this to be the best deck moving in, and it was certainly up there. Monarch has kind of 2 diverging builds. The first is the one that's been featured on this channel that includes Zaborg. I think the 12th place player was also playing this strategy. This deck aims to use Zaborg, the big-ass Mega Monarch, to pop a light monster, usually itself or Aether, then mill 8 cards from its own extra deck, including enough cards to just overwhelm the opponent in advantage. Drawing off Garura, setting up multiple activations of Jurak Meteor, like that's impossible to beat through. Moreover, it also gets to choose the cards to send from the opponent's extra deck, which means you can cut an opponent playing a real deck off of everything. The other build of the deck is the Honko Chow build that did well at the YG Organization tournament. That deck plays Garoom, the Wind Vassal, and Mithra to set up a line in which you not only Erebus a couple of times, but Thestalos the remaining cards out of an opponent's hand. It has a super consistent 5-card hand loop, but after being interrupted, can pivot down to a lower number and a domain, so they can domain lock you out of the game. That said, the winningest Monarch strategy, the one that I think got second in Swiss, was not doing either of those things. It played 3 copies of Pot of Greed and elected to forego either domain lock or like a stupid Zaborg FTK or hand loop. I spoke at length to the pilot, and basically they told me they were Erebusing twice in order to get the opponent down to 4 cards, and then just setting up a Monarch board. The Monarch board is a couple of interactions. You have the ability with the Monarch's Master Plan to tribute on your opponent's turn, which is good, of course. Aether probably needs no introduction. But mostly it's just impossible to kill through the Monarch board. They have the Aether summon, so that's 2 bodies right there. Prime Monarch in the graveyard, which is an additional body. The Monarch's Master Plan permits you to tribute over it, which isn't an additional body, but is interruption. If a Tessera gets into the mix, well, the Tessera goes to the yard, and that's going to summon out an Adia, which is going to summon out an Eidos. And of course, if you ever perform a tribute summon, then Big Eidos comes back from the graveyard. This is like 9 bodies to get through, which is impossible for anything in Genesis. Then on your turn, you automatically win because nothing can beat Stormforth Erebus. I like this deck a great deal. I think the version of it that is not playing any of the bullshit is a lot of fun to have in the format. Next up is Cool Tune. I don't think this surprised anyone. This is a deck that has a very low point total associated with it, benefits off of playing low pointed hand traps, and is new, therefore the cards are a little pushed. Cool Tune is not really seeing success in the TCG, so I think it's good that there is a place where this deck feels at home. I see a lot of people whining that like it's tier 2 in the TCG and why is it playable here? I don't know where you guys are getting your information. This deck is not tier 2 in the TCG. Not yet. There's a fun push-pull with this deck in that your hand trap lineup matters a lot when considering this strategy. A lot of situations where like a Skullmeister or a DD Crow can do a lot of work against something like a Remix. But of course, the card that absolutely hoses this deck is Ghost Bell, and a lot of people elected to play this card for that reason, and were very successful with it. I think as people get more familiar with what this deck actually does, it will drop off in terms of like top tieredness. Once they start boarding in kaijus and thinking critically about board states, things will change. For instance, I played the Duelist on Super Quant in a late round, and in game 2, she started reading Zaylin, and I was like, oh no, she's reading Zaylin. And after that, never built a chain ever again, and just won the game off that. Next up is Radiant Typhoon. This deck, like Cool Tune, is a newer archetype. It is drastically unpointed relative to its power level. It just got a cool new card, and it's seeing a smattering of success in the TCG, though in a very different context. Radiant Typhoon has some weaknesses in Genesis that it doesn't in the TCG. The Link Varun really solves like the where did the mandate go problem. That's not to say this deck isn't incredibly powerful, and given that Radiant Typhoon has already been powerful at least once in Genesis, I would not be surprised if the update absolutely eviscerates it. We gotta talk about Sheena too. Oh my god, Sheena's so good. After that is Draco Tail. This is the one I see the least defense for. This probably should be pointed much higher. It is at least a little frustrating that the deck that I think unquestionably is the best in the TCG is also a top tier strategy in Genesis. This is also one of those decks where like the cards that beat it really beat it. Like people are boarding non-fusion area. Obviously that's really good. And sometimes it sort of loses to itself. You can draw a couple of Urgula and look at a hand that just does nothing and think, why am I playing this? But when it goes off, it's functionally unbeatable. Like there is very little that stands up to it. After that is Artmage, another new deck that is drastically underpointed. Not too much to say about this one that hasn't already been said. I think this deck is a welcome addition to the format. I think it's cool that the deck exists in the capacity it does, though it is sort of playable in the TCG in terms of Artmage Canine. The way the deck functions in Genesis is fundamentally different. And finally, Punk Psychic, I think, is a top strategy as well. This is a deck that saw no play in the TCG, and it's not really hard to see why. It's a big, sexy combo deck that takes 1 million damage and loses to Nibiru. But here, Nibiru isn't really guaranteed. You play the new Punk stuff, but you also play the Banish Psychics that came out like a couple of sets ago. You play a board that is super layered, super intense, doesn't really lose to one piece of board breakery. Like, you can fire off an Ulti Slayer and trade for 2 things, but they'll usually have 4 points of interaction. And they can also go into Pep, which is impossible for a significant amount of decks to out. Under that, there are a number of decks that I think are at least playable. Doom Z playing 1 copy of Premature Burial, I think is one of those decks that sort of justifies Genesis, using a really old card to benefit a really new archetype in a way that just can't ever be done in the TCG. That deck got second at the American Proto YCS. Really unbelievable shout out to that individual. Onomat is apparently still around. Same person who won the last Invitational, topped with it this time. Who needed Dota Warrior, I guess. White Forest is a deck that's just sort of perennially around in the format. It got a lot as Droll was removed from the list of cards people were considering, but it does still lose to other traps. Exorcister, I think, is really good. It's not represented in either of the top 8s, but I think it is definitely powerful and probably the premier Dimension Shifter deck because it can just add it back to the hand. On the subject of decks that make a damn good use out of Dimension Shifter, Goatee I was surprised to see very little of. There were some in the top 16, and the tool that this deck has gotten recently is the first Penguin, which I think pushes it over the edge. In testing, I never beat Goatee. Finally, Galaxy Genesys was also represented in the top 16, but of course not the top 8, so no lists are out. That, I think, is comparable to Monarch insofar as if you go first, you automatically win. But a significant amount of people integrated lines from that deck into their normal deck, utilizing surfacing Big Jaws in order to get to, like, the Mr. Galaxy man. On that note, it's a good pivot to what I think should happen with the points. So the first is that some decks and engines are obviously drastically underpointed. Cool Toon, Artmage, Doomsy, Dracotail, Radiant Typhoon, Exosister, Monarch, the Surfacing Big Jaws package, all of these could get points associated with them. And I think will. Like, Eidos is the most obvious 10 I've ever seen in my life. Medius is a 10 for sure, and I'm not just saying that because he's a twink. As Exosister and Goatee rise in playability as well, I hope they revisit Dimension Shifter. I hope it goes the way of the Droll and Lockbird and ends up being like prohibitively expensive. Maybe they splash a singleton copy. I really don't like that card. And I don't think there's sufficient counterplay to it in this format. You can Lancia, but that's not going to help you on your own turn. And I think we do need to have a discussion about banning individual cards. First and foremost, I hate to be like this, but Trinity format has already done the work for you. This format that's been in development for a decade has basically boxed out anything that could even remotely resemble a floodgate. And I'm pretty sure Konami already cross-referenced to the list because a lot of the garbage from that list is 100 pointed in Genesis, like Angel 07. But keep going. Like, there's no reason to keep poisonous winds in the format until it becomes a problem. Non-fusion area could go. Soundproofed can go. Like, these don't make fun games happen. But there are 5 cards I think absolutely must be pointed at 100 pretty much immediately. The first, as mentioned, are Soundproofed and Non-Fusion Area. These cut off entire mechanisms of play, and I don't think they have a place in a game that is going to go to turn 5. Like, it's not fun to play Find the Cosmic Cyclone or Die if you're Dracotail. It's not fun to play Wait It Out if you're Cool Toon. Speaking of Cool Toon, Gravity Collapse. So I mentioned in my list that Gravity Collapse was the worst performing card in my deck, which is true, but that's a result of the decks that are currently popular. All the top decks having ways around this card doesn't mean that there won't be a different format in which decks won't have a way around this card, or that a different synchro deck with more ability to just lose guys doesn't just start splashing this. I will admit, if this card resolves on your opponent's normal summon, you do just straight up win. That's not fun. That's not, like, fun at all. In fact, I think there's a number of cards that automatically win you the game going first that need to go, which brings me to my next card, Mistaken Arrest. Card seeing a lot of play. It is really frustrating that Droll and Lockbird's most annoying use case is doing your whole combo, your opponent takes an action, and you go Droll and Lockbird. You can do the same thing with Mistaken Arrest. Sure, it prevents you from popping off on your opponent's turn, but if you've got a full board and setup and follow-up, who cares? And finally, I want to talk specifically about Dimensional Barrier. So I've talked a lot about is Macro a floodgate in the past. If Konami believes that Macro is not a floodgate, well, then it doesn't really matter. If Konami believes that banishing everything doesn't constitute a floodgate, they're not going to apply the 100 points that floodgates usually get to it. And I think at this point we can definitively say they don't. They think that's okay. But Dimensional Fissure is a little different. Firing Dimensional Fissure turn 1 isn't just Macrocosmos, it's also Called by the Grave. In the TCG, people have been experimenting with Dimensional Fissure going first, and it's caught on a little, but in Genesis, it's a lot better. In the TCG, if your opponent leads Dimensional Barrier, you can still Mulcharmy-Fuelos them, Perulia them, Ash Blossom them. In Genesis, the suite of hand traps is so incredibly truncated that you really can't do a whole lot of anything. The 2 premier free hand traps in the format, DD Crow and Skullmeister, are useless under Dimensional Fissure. I mean, DD Crow's got to go to the graveyard, of course, but obviously you're not going to be activating an effect in the graveyard if there's no graveyard, and there's nothing to banish from the graveyard if there's no graveyard. Keep moving down the list and you check out the 3-pointers, Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. Mourner still works, but Ghost Ogre has to go to the graveyard in order to trigger, which means she's offline as well. Keep moving to the 5s, Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion shows up, and while this card can be activated under Dimensional Fissure, it won't. Like, you're not going to be banishing cards from the graveyard. There's nothing in the graveyard. And finally, if you move to the 7s, the big one that sees a lot of play is Veiler, who has to go to the graveyard in order to activate. So if you slam down a Dimensional Barrier, you can pretty much stop playing around anything but Nibiru and Ghost Mourner, a card with pretty limited applicability. And that's bad. Like, that, like, Called by the Grave is pointed to shit. This is just Called by the Grave. So, in conclusion, I had a great time playing Genesis. In its current state, it definitely ranks in the top formats of all time for me, which is crazy. I've played like all of them. But I can't deny that it came at a little bit of an inopportune moment. The potential moment for Genesis was if it took off during a period when the TCG was languishing, when people were just kind of rolling their eyes and getting through events, waiting for a release that would finally make it fun and playable. But the TCG's really good right now. So the question becomes, if the format is good, do we need a place to escape? And that's where I'd like to reconceptualize Genesys. I don't want it to be this liminal format that you play while you wait for a better one to emerge in the real card game. I think this thing only succeeds if it is good in its own right, if it is the modern to Magic's standard, or vice versa. Me personally, despite the fact that the TCG is good, despite the fact I have cards for it, despite the fact that I'm practiced enough I would have loved to enter, I was very proud to play Genesys at the 300th YCS, and I had a crazy good time doing so. Of the games I played, almost all of them were incredibly back and forth, meaty games with a lot of decision points. There was a lot of room for players to express their individual skill and be rewarded for it. There were so few times when the cards I complained about above even mattered. Like I said, in something like 30 games I played, I think I gravity collapsed once in a game that may have mattered. If you are looking for an escape from the TCG, I really would urge you not to try out Genesys. I think you should be playing it if you love Yu-Gi-Oh! And want more. As a final note, I did get to talk to some Konami executives about Genesys format, and they told me, bar none, the best thing that can be done for the health of the format is for people to use the hashtag Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesys and post lists they are playing or lists they are seeing from their locals. If you have an OTS that's hosting Genesys events, be the dickhead that gets those lists. If you are brewing, post them online. And please, please, please use the hashtag Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesys when you do so. There will be more Genesys content on this channel. I'll be playing it at future events, and I hope to see you there as well.